This video will go over what we consider the two best DPS specs and the related best in slots for them, Nightfall Ruin and Backdraft Fire Destruction. Both of these sim very close together, so in our opinion you should just go with what you prefer, but there are small DPS improvements depending on what race you choose and what build you choose to combine it with. These results are based on you being an enchanter and tailor for your professions to take advantage of the new epic tailoring recipe and new enchanting consumable from this phase, while the fights were simmed off an average 60-second fight length plus faction appropriate buffs, full war buffs, raid debuffs from the appropriate classes, and consumables including the new enchanting consumable in multiple batches of 30,000 times for each race. These are the specific specialization we've used to sim the results as well. On the left is the Nightfall Ruin build, and on the right is the Backdraft Fire Destruction build. Both of their standard cookie cutter builds being passed around using the imp as your pet for both of them, so that it's as science accurate as possible for comparison to other people's lists. Now moving on to the Backdraft Fire Destruction BiS list. For Backdraft Fire Destruction BiS this phase, you're looking at using Visage of the Exiled, Jindo's Lost Locket, Fractured Mind Pauldrons, Haku's Hexcape, Malevolent Prophet Set, Dryad's Wristbandings, Atalai Hexer's Gloves, Cord of the Untamed, Drakeclaw Band of the Harbinger, Loop of Burning Blood, and Infernal Pact Essence plus Breath of the Beast as your trinket choices. For weapons, you want to use Hubris the Bandit Brander, Drakestone of the Blood Prophet, and Pirate Caduceus as your wand. With this gear and setup mentioned at the beginning of the video, you'll be averaging 1,563 DPS as a gnome, 1,551 DPS as a human, 1,535 DPS as undead, and 1,513 DPS as orc. Small note at the end here, Blade of the Eternal Darkness seems basically the same as Hubris, which beats out Glimmering Gizmo Blade, so choose based on whether you want to farm Marden or raid drops for your weapon. And Visage of the Exile seems basically the same as Eye of the Flame, so same choice here. If you want to spend that extra money on Eye of the Flame for an extra 1.5 to 1 DPS, feel free to dump money in it, otherwise your best bet is to farm the Visage of the Exile from raid drops. For Backdraft Fire Pre-BiS, again technically Eye of the Flame would be your Pre-BiS by a wide margin over the next best items, but will cost a pretty penny if you're purchasing it, or take a lot of time to farm out. But it does come with a 15 DPS over example the Filament Monocle that you have from last phase. If you don't want to mess with that, you can always stick with the Neuro-linked Arcano Filament Monocle, which you definitely have probably from last phase, but is far worse than that option. There are also technically the Engineering Monocles that would give plus 35 fire damage, but you lose DPS dropping the enchanting for Engineering to wear the glasses, and because you lose access to the new enchanting consumable. From there, you use Piston Pendant, Rock Grip Mantle, Sprite Caster Cape, 3-piece Irradiated Set, Dryad's Wrist Bindings, Of Fire Wrath plus 26 Fire, Green Gloves, Cord of the Untamed, Loop of Burning Blood, Cyclopean Band, Infernal Pact Essence, and Breath of the Beast. For weapons, you'd want to use Blade of Eternal Darkness or Glimmering Gizmo Blade, Enthralled Sphere, and Pirate Caduceus. These results in the average DPS of 1,465 for gnomes, 1,456 for humans, 1,455 for undead, and 1,435 for orcs. As you can see, there are a lot of crossover between these two sets between Pre-BiS and BiS that makes farming a lot of these Pre-BiS items out worth it, since you'll be able to use them for your entire phase as your phase 3 BiS. Moving on to Nightfall Ruin, it honestly is looking very similar to Fire Destruction best in slot. You'll want to use Visage of the Exiled, Jindo's Lost Locket, Fractured Mind Pauldrons, Haku's Hexcape, Malevolent Prophet Set, Dryad's Wrist Bindings, Atalai Hexer's Gloves, Cord of the Untamed, Drakeclaw Band of the Harbinger, Cyclopean Band, and Infernal Pact Essence plus Atalai Blood Ritual Charm as your trinket choices. For weapons, you'll want to use Hubris the Bandit Brander, Drakestone of the Nightmare Harbinger, and Nightmare Trophy. The Nightfall Ruin Blade of the Eternal Darkness is simming 5 DPS less on average than Hubris the Bandit Brander and about 3 DPS higher than Glimmering Gizmo Blade. Using this set of gear, you'll average 1,560 DPS as gnomes, 1,543 DPS as humans, 1,522 DPS as undead, and 1,531 DPS as orc. Our next section will be taking a look at the pre-raid BiS options for the Nightfall Ruin build. Nightfall Ruin's pre-BiS looks very similar to Backdraft Ruin Pre-BiS. We're looking at a very similar layout, Neuro-linked Arcano Filament Monocle, Piston Pendant, Rock Grip Mantle, Sprite Caster Cape, 3-piece Irradiated Set, Dryad's Wrist Bindings, Dreamweave Gloves, Lorekeeper or Advisor's level 48 PvP Ring, Cyclopean Band, and for trinkets, Miniaturized Combustion Chamber and Infernal Pact Essence. Your weapons would be Blade of Eternal Darkness, Enthralled Sphere, and Mecha No Strider Gear Shifter for the wand. One last note though for the weapons, technically Blade of Eternal Darkness outsins Glimmering Gizmo Blade by 4 DPS. However, even with the buff to the drop rate, the amount of effort needed to farm this out when you'll definitely be replacing it with Pre-BiS Bandit Brander later on makes it skippable in our opinion, unless you just happen to have the worst luck ever with Pre-BiS dropping, or you're looking for something to do in between your raid lockouts. And honestly, it is technically soloable, so it's all up to you how much effort you want to put in. Using this setup though, you'll average 1,460 DPS as a gnome, 1,448 DPS as a human, 1,424 DPS as an undead, and 1,435 DPS as an orc. Lastly for science, we'll take the Pre-BiS setups and swap out the items for 6-piece rank 7 gear, and the Emerald Warden reputation set. For science, doing that with the full rank 7 set for Backdraft Fire Destruction results in an average DPS of 1,448 DPS for gnomes, 1,441 DPS for humans, 1,440 DPS for undead, and 1,419 DPS for orcs. And the full emerald set for the Backdraft Fire averages to 1,433 DPS for gnomes, 1,422 DPS for humans, 1,423 DPS for undead, and 1,404 DPS for orcs. Moving over to the Nightfall Ruin, the rank 7 set results in an average DPS of 1,440 for gnomes, 1,422 for humans, 1,423 for undead, and 1,433 DPS for orcs. The emerald sets for Nightfall Ruin result in an average of 1,419 for gnomes, 1,406 for humans, 1,405 for undead, and 1,414 for orcs. Taking these results into account, it's fine to go with either of these DPS builds for raid DPS options, though again, at least for Horde, you will eke out a slightly bit more DPS as one build and Wraith combo over the other, such as Undead having slightly higher DPS than Orcs using the Fire Destruction build, but Orcs having slightly higher DPS than Undead at the Nightfall Ruin build. Unfortunately for Ally, Gnome rules supreme over humans in both specs. Sad truth is though, that for Warlocks going from a pre-raid BiS DPS to full BiS DPS in Phase 3 is only an increase on average of about 80 to 100 DPS for every race. Now that's not something to ignore or scoff at by any means, but we are definitely on the lower end for gear scaling this phase compared to some of the other classes that have increased. If you enjoyed our video and like to see more, hit that subscribe button, and why not give us a like to support us. Thanks for tuning in and have a good night!